This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hello, and welcome to the second episode in this five-part series that I'm calling Waves of Change, Immigration in the United States. In today's episode of Waves of Change, we'll explore this second wave of immigration to the United States, which took place between 1865 and 1915. During this period, over 25 million immigrants arrived, transforming America's demographic landscape and laying the groundwork for much of the modern United States. This era is especially significant because it marks a departure from earlier immigration patterns. While the first wave of immigrants primarily came from Northern and Western Europe, this second wave introduced millions from Southern and Eastern Europe, along with notable numbers from Asia and Latin America. Today we'll analyze their reasons for leaving, their experiences upon arrival, and their enduring impact on American society. So why study the second wave? The second wave of immigration coincided with two transformative periods in the United States, the Industrial Revolution and the Progressive Era. These immigrants didn't just arrive, they reshaped cities, fueled industries, and introduced cultural diversity that redefined the American identity. However, the arrival of these immigrants also sparked tensions, leading to the restrictive policies and debates over what it meant to be American. In this episode, we'll analyze the driving forces behind this wave, the systems immigrants encountered at America's ports, and how these immigrants adapted to and shaped life in their new home. So there are push factors, and let's begin by examining the conditions that drove the millions to leave their homelands. These push factors included economic hardships, persecution, and political instability. Let's begin with the economic challenges. First, there was land scarcity. By the 19th century, population growth in rural Europe created intense competition for farmland in Europe. In countries like Italy, small-scale farmers were squeezed out as larger estates dominated agricultural production in their country. The second economic challenges that the Europeans faced was mechanization. The spread of machinery across European agriculture displaced manual laborers, forcing many of these European farmers to look abroad for work. Then there was political and religious persecution. Jewish pogroms, and a pogrom is where Jews are actively hunted down to be hung from their neck. A Jewish pogrom in Russia between the 1880s and early 1900s, Jewish communities in Eastern Europe faced violent, state-supported pogroms that destroyed homes, businesses, and synagogues. These attacks were compounded by discriminatory laws that restricted where Jews could live and work. Another example of political and religious persecution were the Armenian Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The late 19th century saw rising violence against Armenian Christians, culminating in massacres that forced displacements from what is now Turkey, but was then the Ottoman Empire. Another example of political and religious persecution involves the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920. The political unrest during the Mexican Revolution disrupted daily life, prompting many Mexican families to flee the violence and flee economic instability that the revolution caused, encouraging many to come to the more stable and less violent United States. Another push factor that immigrants experienced were simple natural disasters, and overpopulation. An example would be in southern Italy. Volcanic eruptions like Mount Vesuvius in 1906 and earthquakes in Italy added to the already dire economic conditions in southern Italy, making migration out of that region an increasingly attractive option. There were pull factors. Just as important as forces pushing immigrants out were the factors pulling them toward the United States. And the major pull factors were industrial jobs, family networks and chain migration, and the promise of freedom. Let me break this down. The pull factor from industrial jobs included factory recruitment. American factories sought cheap labor and actively recruited in Europe and Asia. Factory recruiters often exaggerated the opportunities which were available. They painted a picture of prosperity which wasn't always accurate. Another pull factor involved with industrial jobs was the steamship companies. Affordable fares made transatlantic travel accessible to many working class families, as it simply became cheaper to buy tickets on steamships traveling across the Atlantic. More families were able to come, and families that of lesser means who could not immigrate to the United States, now they finally could. And as transportation got cheaper, more people simply came. Another pull factor involved with industrial jobs, finally, is railroad advertisements. Railroads in the United States, eager to settle the West, advertised cheap land in the Midwest, drawing many Germans and Scandinavian farmers who were looking for land. There were family networks which caused chain migration, and it's definitely a pull factor that's worth discussing. Chain migration, by the way, is a type of migration where it's defined that a migration was caused because you were attracted to someone on the other side, and it's called a chain migration because there's a link. And an example simply would be if a family member were in country B and you're in country A, the reason why you're going to country B is to be with your family member, that family member being a link, and because it's a link, therefore it's a chain. So it's referred to as a chain migration. It's a pretty common form of migration. Someone goes live someone because their family is there. Someone goes to study at a school in a foreign country because their cousin, brother, or sister are there. Simple examples of chain migration. And it's an example of the power of family network. And this was definitely at play for this second migration period in the United States as well. And largely it's seen as letters, which were sent by earlier immigrants to their family back home, encouraged their relatives to join them. And this is, of course, known as the chain migration. And this process created tightly knit ethnic enclaves where new arrivals could find support and familiarity, which makes chain migration so successful. Because when someone's coming into a new foreign land, they have a community of trusted loved ones who can help them. And, chain migrations are still important today. Okay, the last pull factor I will bring up is the promise of freedom. The United States Constitution guarantees religious and political liberty, and that was a powerful motivator. For Jews fleeing persecution, or Armenians escaping violence, or the 48ers, the Germans who were leaving because of political and, largely political freedoms being threatened, the Bill of Rights symbolized safety and opportunity in the United States. Okay, so how were the immigrants processed? Once the immigrants arrived, immigrants faced rigorous processing at America's ports of entry. Let's examine the two most prominent points, Ellis Island and Angel Island. Ellis Island, which operated from 1892 to 1954. Ellis Island is located in New York Harbor, and Ellis Island processed over 12 million immigrants during its operation. There were inspections. Immigrants underwent medical exams to be screened for diseases like trachoma and tuberculosis. Those immigrants who were deemed unhealthy could be quarantined or deported back to their country of origin. And the process also involved legal interviews. U.S. officials questioned immigrants about their work skills, family connections, and intentions in the United States. And, this wasn't so bad, actually. As long as they showed that they were willing to work, they were let in. It was, very few people were actually turned away, but they wanted people who were going to be put to work. The Statue of Liberty, which was built in 1886, became part of the experience of Ellis Island. Standing as a beacon near Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty symbolized hope and freedom for millions. Its base at the Statue of Liberty is inscribed with a poem written by Emma Lazarus, including the very famous line, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." For many immigrants that came through Ellis Island, New York, the Statue of Liberty had a profound psychological impact upon them on arrival. Okay, moving on to the second port of entry was Angel Island. Angel Island operated from 1910 to 1940. It's located in San Francisco Bay. Angel Island served as the primary point of entry for Asian immigrants who, of course, that's their nearest port of entry, whether they're Chinese or Japanese or Philippine. Unlike Ellis Island, Angel Island was known for its strict enforcement of immigration laws, particularly those targeting Chinese immigrants under the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were detentions at Angel Island. Immigrants were often held for weeks or months while officials scrutinized their documents and questioned them intensively. The immigrants that came through Angel Island definitely had a harder time when compared to those coming through Ellis Island. A lot of it was racism, but that racism can be tied to familiarity, as almost all Americans were from a European background of some sort. Other European immigrants who came through Ellis Island had a simply easier time. There was less of a language barrier, and the documents were more understood when they brought documents from Romania, Italy, or Germany. Yes, incoming European immigrants of different nationalities had a little bit more scrutiny, but they still made it through. In Angel Island, it was much harder. The people who came through, and if they didn't speak any English, it was hard to find someone in Angel Island who spoke that language of the immigrant. And documents that came from China and Japan were difficult to understood and were seen more suspiciously. So, yes, the experience of those who came in through Angel Island were different than that experience of Ellis Island. Okay, when the immigrants got into America, they definitely had a life in America. And I would like to kind of explore ethnic neighborhoods in the cities, struggles and hardships, and finally their contributions. So, life in America, as many immigrants from the second wave settled into cities, ethnic neighborhoods are going to play very prominently in the immigrant experience in the second wave. To navigate their new lives, these immigrants often settled in ethnic enclaves that allowed them to preserve their cultural practices while adapting to American life. These urban neighborhoods became vital spaces for community building, offering social support and a sense of familiarity to a new land. Examples include Little Italy in New York, where Italians preserved their language, traditions, and cuisines, establishing grocery stores, churches, and cultural festivals that connected them to their heritage. There was Chinatown in San Francisco, a hub for Chinese immigrants. Chinatown provided economic, social support amid widespread discrimination and widespread exclusionary laws. In Chicago, a rapidly growing industrial hub in this era, ethnic enclaves flourished, reflecting the diversity of immigrant groups. There was Germantown in Chicago, German immigrants established thriving communities in neighborhoods like Lincoln Square, known for their focus on family life, education, and cultural traditions. These Germans introduced public parks, German language schools, and cultural events such as Christmas markets, which still operate in Chicago today and have been adopted by other cities throughout the United States. The emphasis of German craftsmanship and skilled labor also contributed to Chicago's industrial and architectural development. There were Scandinavian neighborhoods in Chicago. These Scandinavian immigrants, particularly Swedes, but also include Danes, concentrated in areas like Andersonville. These Scandinavians brought agricultural expertise and a strong sense of community. Anderson became a center for Swedish American culture, featuring Swedish bakeries, Lutheran churches, and midsummer festivals. Today, its Swedish American Museum preserves this rich heritage. These enclaves provided immigrants with a bridge between their old and new worlds. These enclaves allowed for the retention of cultural identities while offering pathways to economic stability and social integration in America. These immigrants did have struggles and hardships. In this second wave, there was poverty and poor treatment. Many immigrants lived in overcrowded, unsanitary tenements. Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, through photographs, expose the harsh realities of urban immigrant life, often showing images of people who were overworked, dirty, overcrowded, and with very poor conditions. Another struggle and hardship was acculturation. Immigrant children adapted quickly to American culture, often becoming cultural intermediaries between their parents and their broader society. However, the immigrants themselves sometimes had hard times adopting to American culture as they came over older and as adults and were often left out. And of course, the immigrants then feared that their children were losing their native culture. The immigrants did have contributions. These immigrants provided the labor that fueled America's industrial rise. These immigrants built railroads, staffed factories, and developed agricultural regions. These immigrants, their cultural contributions brought new foods, traditions, and ideas that enriched American society. For example, Jewish immigrants brought vibrant cultural expressions in literature and theater, while Italian immigrants influenced urban architecture and art. Historians have analyzed this second wave of immigration from multiple angles. Oscar Handlin, again in his book The Uprooted in 1951, celebrates immigrants as the backbone of America's growth, emphasizing the resilience of these immigrants. Ngai, and the last name is Ngai, writes in Impossible Subjects, published in 2004, critiques the contradictions in the United States immigration policy, particularly the racialized treatment of Asian Americans. Ngai critiques that at one hand, immigrants are encouraged to come to the United States to contribute to building, contribute to being cheap labor and building the West, but then are, when brought into the United States, are treated as second-class humans. Jacob Riis, the photographer, his work documented the harsh realities of immigrant life, sparking calls for urban reform. And finally, Horace Kalin advocates for cultural pluralism. Horace argues that immigrant diversity enriched the American identity rather than diluting it. The second wave of immigration between 1865 and 1915 transformed the United States, bringing diversity, labor, and culture, while sparking debates that continue today. As we wrap up, I'd like you to consider three discussion questions. How did the experience of immigrants differ based on their points of origin? How did ethnic enclaves help immigrants adapt to American life? And finally, what parallels exist between the challenges of 19th century immigrants and those challenges which are faced by modern immigrants today? In our next episode, we won't challenge. In our next episode, we'll examine the rise of nativism and restrictive immigration policies in response to these transformative changes. Thank you for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.